My name's Liz Mead, and I'm previously Detective Chief Superintendent from Bedfordshire Police, where I was the head of crime and head of public protection. I'm continuing my story of my career, and we had finished the last session where I just arrived at Bedfordshire Police headquarters, 19 years old and 2 weeks in June 1990, to start my policing career as a WPC, as we were called back then. So I spent the first couple of weeks at headquarters. We also had the opportunity to lots of different other agencies to see how there was collaboration, even back then, with other departments and other places. One of the places I think that most probably resonates most with me was when I went to the Luton Rape Crisis Centre way back in 1990. And it very much, I think, said to me, actually, this is an area that I'm really interested in, of the actual help and support that can be provided to victims. And we have, I think, in terms of policing, made amazing strides in terms of how we deal with victims. But it was people that early on, in the 90s, who were doing those centres that really helped me in shape my thinking, I think, around the victim journey. So all these things were really helpful when you started. I did go out with the electricity board and cut the electric off, clambering over fences, doing all sorts of things, going out with the ambulance for the day. It was absolutely fascinating insight into other agencies and also the links with policing. But then we had the exams we had to pass, we had to learn the law, and ended up going to Ashford Training Centre in Kent for the basic training for 10 weeks, coming back and doing a little bit more policing for 5 weeks as a probationary constable, and then going back to Ashford for another 5 to finish my training. And once I'd finished my training, I was posted to Luton. And I was absolutely delighted to be going to Luton. Luton's on my birth certificate, and I think of myself as a Luton girl. And to be able to police an area that you were born meant so much to me. I started on A section. You always remember your section, you always remember your first sergeant, your first inspector, and the team that you were with. And you also always remember your first arrest. Now, we worked down what was called the Arndale Centre there. It's called the Mall in Luton now. And I had a tutor constable, and he said I was just called a Jonah, actually, because I brought him bad luck the whole time he tutored me. And he said it didn't start well with the first arrest. There was a shop, this is quite funny really, when you think about what shops are no longer there. So C&A was the shop in the Mall in Luton, whereby we were called for a shoplifter being detained. And unbeknown to me, the shoplifter that had been detained was a regular. First time I'd been on patrol, first time I'd made my arrest, but my tutor knew who this individual was and went, and did the eye roll when he heard who it was that was being arrested. And I was all very nervous, but I was all very trying to be precise and proper about making sure I could remember the caution, making sure I could remember exactly what I needed to say. And we were in this little store cupboard, basically, with the store detective saying what had happened. And I arrested her, and her first words were, "I've taken an overdose." And I was like, well, where was that in the training manual? What do I do now? So like this frozen look on my face, as if to say to my tutor, what do I do? And again, rather than going to the police station, that meant that we had to go to the accident and emergency department, whereby my first shift and my first arrest was spent with a bowl so this lady could have her overdose medication and then be okay. And then it was 9 hours later, we went back to the police station where we dealt with her for the shoplifting of, I think it was a small piece of underwear, that's what it was. And it was just really one of those things where I think, gosh, my career didn't get off to the best start. As I said, my tutor constable always said I was bad luck, because so many things happened to him the first couple of weeks that he was tutoring me. I then was on section, on shift, and I think there's a few things. We had to do football duty, which I absolutely loved. I've always loved my football. I'm a massive Spurs fan, but we had to do Luton Town. So Luton Town are my second team. And I always managed to try and get the tunnel, which was the link between the fourth official and the referee. And you'd stand there, and I just loved being able to watch the football, but also had to police it as well, may I just add. there were always, all the footballers went past, being a massive football fan. But I always remember most of the managers just used to ignore you. But Brian Clough was the most absolutely charming manager there was, would always say hello, how are you, thank you for being there. And that just really stuck. A couple of nice words from someone can make someone's, can really make someone's day. Even if you're a police officer, you sometimes need those nice words as well. And so policing the football was good. And then there were other different, things that you'd get sent to. And I think when we talk about like back in the 90s and what in particular female police officers, we had to wear a skirt. They, which I think is quite bizarre really when you think about it, but you could wear trousers, but you had to wear trousers only on a night shift. So when it was pitch black at 10 o'clock at night, you could wear trousers, but you couldn't wear them during the day. So in effect, when you were clambering over a fence in broad daylight, everyone could see everything. But at night, when it was pitch black, they couldn't. Now, I don't know who came up with that policy. I can only imagine. So there were some very different things that happened. And then eventually we were allowed to wear trousers all the time on our night shift. And we weren't allowed, I had quite a old-fashioned sergeant who wouldn't allow two female officers to be crewed together because he said, oh, well, all you'll do is just talk all night and you won't actually get any policing done. So that's not going to happen. We're always going to mix them up. But there was this 1 week of night shifts whereby there was myself and another female officer. We actually were crewed together because they had to crew it like that. And we went out that week to make sure that we got the most arrests, and we did. And we had a blinding week. I think, we arrested, I think, something like 11 people that set of nights. Ranging from burglars to car thieves, and it was just kind of, that's what I'm going to say, it was two fingers up to them to say, do you know what, look what we can do, and it actually doesn't matter whether you're male or female in a car, two females together can actually get good results. So I'll always remember that. And the other officer who was with me, even when I retired last year, we had to have that conversation about, do you remember that week when we did that we were working on Marsh Harmon, we did that, all that amazing stuff. So those things kind of stay with you. I also think they kind of shape who you become as a manager and as a leader as well, in terms of, don't ever second guess who individuals are and the impact that they're going to have. So when I finished on section, I was able to go and work on the Vice unit in Luton, which was a small unit that dealt with prostitution issues within the Luton area. And I was the only female on that team with 5 other PCs, and we used to patrol the what was called the red light area of Luton at the time, and work alongside the girls who were called prostitutes then. And I think, back at the language and the terminology we used in the early 90s, because this was around 93 to 95, and a 16-year-old girl would be called a prostitute. Why on earth were we calling them prostitutes? Actually, when you think about now, that is a young girl that is being sexually exploited, and the women were being sexually exploited as well. Very different terminology, thankfully, that we use now, but also very different attitude towards the on-street sex trade and sex workers, as opposed to being called prostitutes. Awful language. But it was a time in my career that I did actually really enjoy. I had a really good rapport with the girls that were working. We were an occupational hazard for them. They would try and work out what shifts we were doing, and then when they'd see us, they were like, oh, we've got it wrong, you're out again. Oh, and we'd have a conversation around how their kids were and those things, and they kind of just became, you got to know them. They were regular people that you were arresting for loitering, and then you also had to deal with the curb crawlers. Really the reason why they were there was because you had customers. So the curb crawlers would come around, and we would do sometimes decoy operations. So myself and we would get another colleague in potentially to help. So you'd have 2 females just standing literally on a street corner, minding our own business, because it was actually an area where residents were, an area where students walked through, and they were regularly being approached and having awful things asked of them by a lot of the curb crawlers that went past. So we would do decoy operations. And I do remember a colleague of mine, we were standing on the corner and just approached by a car, and it always used to amaze me that, the individuals were, they just looked so normal. That's what I was always thinking. They approached so normal. And, the things that they would ask for was just like, just bizarre. £1,000 for a night, please. It's like, gosh, £1,000. You'd want to pay £1,000 in 1990. And then you'd kind of say, I don't know what you're talking about. And you'd kind of like stand back, and then your colleagues would be looking. I mean, this was all prior to the surveillance legislation that came in. What we call the Ripper Act that came in 1998. This was all prior to that, so there was not the guidelines, or not the safety really. And when I think about it, some of the things, we could have been bundled into a car quite easily, but it was just what we did. And what would happen is we'd kind of do a signal over to our colleagues who were watching us that a proposition in effect we had been solicited, and they would then we would just walk away, and they would then follow the car. We would get into another police car and go to where the vehicle was eventually stopped, usually 1 mile, 2 miles down the road, and we would get out of the car and then approach the person that's just made the proposition to us, and say, this is what you've just said to us. You've just proposed what you want to do to us, and this is how much you want to pay. I'm a police officer, and you'd show your badge, and you could just see they're like, oh, right, I've just sent it to a police officer. But at that time, what we would do is we would give them a warning. We would send a letter to their home address, which I think most probably would be actually worse. The fact that they would have to potentially stay in for a week waiting for this letter to arrive to say that they'd been seen in an area that they'd propositioned. But at that stage, we didn't take anyone to court. It was just a warning. And we try and publicise the fact that we were working in that area to try and reduce the number of curb crawlers that there were, but also really just to protect the girls that were working. But things are done very differently now. But my vice unit days were really interesting. I think when you sort of, maybe you shouldn't say that you have fun at work, but yeah, we did. We had great fun at work. I really enjoyed working with the girls that were there. They were all characters. They really were, some really hard stories that they had to tell, and how they were trying to just make ends meet, really. And you kind of had a little bit of a kind of an affinity with them. You liked them. And as I say, we were just that occupational hazard. So vice unit days were really interesting, and that got me into kind of working in a plainclothes environment before I eventually started my career as a detective in the office at Luton. So there's quite a lot of stories from being on section and on shift, which were good. And I really enjoyed my time blue lighting it around Luton. When I say blue lighting it, though, it's not quite a blue light from now, though, is it? Where it's all sirens and it's all lots of strobe lights going everywhere. I'm talking a single blue light, in effect, a blue light bulb that just used to go like that on top of a Ford Fiesta. That most of these top mile speed was about 50 miles an hour. So you would go from Luton Police Station, and if there was a shout, so an officer needed assistance or anything, say up in Marsh Farm, you'd have to go from Luton Town Centre up to Marsh Farm on your blue light in your white Ford Fiesta, bibbing cars out of the way with this blue light. You're thinking, why aren't people moving? Well, could you really expect people to see this tiny blue light in the day? So yeah, lots of hairy moments driving up and down through Luton Town Centre, getting to colleagues who needed your support, or getting to jobs. So there were very different things back then, and certainly not the sirens and the noise that you get now. And I certainly enjoyed my time on shift in uniform. But I suppose I always had this thing that I wanted to be a detective. I talked about being, wanting to be Juliet Bravo in my previous conversation, but I kind of also had this Cagney and Lacey feel as well. I wanted to be a female detective, appreciating that it wasn't going to be with guns, etc., in the big streets of New York. It was going to be in Luton or in Bedfordshire, but I really wanted to be a detective. I wanted to be plain clothes. I wanted to kind of deal with the serious jobs, and there were certainly a couple of PCs on my shift who'd become detectives who I really had a lot of admiration for, and I thought, I really want to do that job. I want to maybe do some of the sneaky beaky stuff, a bit of surveillance, a bit of those things, the covert things, as well as doing the serious investigations. And for me, there would be nothing more, I suppose, a pinnacle of a career of being a detective on a murder investigation. Little did I know that I wouldn't just become a detective on a murder investigation, that eventually I would actually be running them one day and running the department. So how I kind of moved on. But you have to remember, I think, your roots, where you come from, where you started, and what it meant to you. And I wasn't in any hurry. I was only 19 years old. I wasn't in a hurry to kind of, with my career, to get promoted. I actually just wanted to learn the job. I wanted to learn what it was to become a police constable, and then to be a detective constable. And then I kind of had a little accident, and I got pregnant, and ended up having 6 months off to have my son. And kind of, it halted my career a bit. It was like, well, this wasn't the plan, the best thing that ever happened to me, but it wasn't the plan, and it wasn't the timing. I was going to be going off and having this career before I had children, but in 1995, it kind of went to a little bit of a halt, really, and that I was like, what am I going to do now? How am I going to be a police officer and a mum as well? Very different times to where we are now. There was no part-time working at all, no flexible working. It was, you do the job or you don't do the job. You do it the same as your colleagues, because, you know, if you're doing part-time work, you're not doing your full shift or all those things. Not the matter of the fact that you wouldn't be earning the money or all those other things. And I just think that when I look back, how 25 years ago there were not any of the kind of the things in place so that people could potentially come back. And I know we lost an awful lot of colleagues who did not come back after having children because they couldn't make it work, or make it work out for them with the shifts, etc. I was incredibly fortunate, a really supportive family, whereby I was able to come back. And whilst I was pregnant, I managed to get a place on CID. I did my interview for CID. There was a couple of hundred people applying for CID in those days. Everyone wanted to become a detective, and I managed to get. There was 30 places available for 18 months worth of detectives, and I got one of those places. So my first day back after maternity leave wasn't just to come back as a police officer on section like I knew. It was to come back in a new role as a woman detective constable, no, actually a woman trainee woman detective constable, because you always have to have the trainee if you're not completely things. So I was a TWDC in the CID office at Luton, and that's where I started my detective career. And when I left in 2020, that was the most important office for me to say goodbye. I had to sit in the seat I'd first sat in all those years ago. And Luton CID know this. They have my heart, always will do. And it's the best office in the world to work in. The people, the energy, the things that they do, and the things that they've seen, the offences that they've dealt with, and dealing with things in such a way. And I think actually that comes over on 24 hours in police custody. So some people may know that it's just a great office with great people, with great enthusiasm. And I absolutely loved my career starting there as a detective.